Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about something that's pretty weighty. We're going to be looking at lead exposure, and specifically from leaded gasoline.
Yeah, most people think that lead in gasoline is a thing of the past. But as we'll see in this deep dive, it's still very much something that affects us today.
Yeah, we've got a stack of research articles here, a bunch of Reddit threads, all sorts of stuff, and it's really kind of opened our eyes to how this legacy of lead is still with us.
That's right. And it's not just, a few isolated cases. We're talking about millions of people potentially dealing with the fallout from lead, even decades after it was phased out of gasoline in the US.
Yeah, and that's the thing that blew my mind. Like, we've got this article here from CNN. And they're saying that over 151 million mental disorder diagnoses in the U.S. alone could be linked back to exposure from leaded gasoline.
151 million, that's a huge number. It's roughly half the US population, potentially carrying the mental health consequences of lead exposure. And what's really unsettling is that we're only beginning to understand the full extent of the impact.
Right, and to think that leaded gasoline was used for what, like starting in the 1920s, to help car engines run smoother, but the U.S. started phasing it out in the 1980s. But get this, some aircraft and other vehicles around the world are still using leaded gasoline today. And that 151 million figure, that's just in the U.S.
It's pretty mind-boggling when you think about the global impact. And what's really important to understand is that this isn't just about individual diagnoses. We could be talking about a shift in the overall mental health baseline for an entire generation.
Oh, okay, so you're saying, like, imagine classroom, and every kid in that classroom is having trouble focusing or feeling a little bit more anxious or impulsive. And that could be because of lead.
That's the kind of baseline shift that lead could be responsible for.
That's a lot to think about. So if I was born, let's say, before 1996, when leaded gas was mostly gone, am I part of that statistic?
It's definitely something to consider, especially if you grew up in areas with heavy traffic or older housing.
Okay, well, let's talk about that a little bit more. Like, what does that mean for me? What does it mean for someone who was exposed to lead?
Well, lead is a neurotoxin, meaning it interferes with the brain's development and function, and it specifically disrupts the development of the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, it's the part of your brain that's responsible for things like decision-making, impulse control, emotional regulation.
Okay, so it's not like you're exposed to lead and you immediately have these problems. It's more like it messes with how your brain develops,
Exactly.
which can then lead to all sorts of issues down the road.
Right, and the effects can vary depending on things like how much lead you were exposed to, how old you were when you were exposed, and even your individual genetic makeup.
So it's complicated.
It is complex. But the main takeaway is that lead exposure can have a big impact on who we are and how we function.
Yeah, okay, that's a little unsettling, to be honest. And it makes you think
Okay.
about, the impact on society as a whole. But before we go down that rabbit hole, let's bring it back down to earth a little bit. Let's talk about our homes. Because this CNN article also talks about how older homes can be a real hotbed for lead.
Oh, absolutely. Lead was a common ingredient in paint for many years, and those old layers can chip and flake off, creating a hazard, especially for young children who, tend to put things in their mouths.
Right. And it's not just paint either.
No, lead pipes were common in older plumbing systems as well, and lead can actually leach into the drinking water.
So we're not just talking about like some dusty old paint in the attic. This stuff could be in the walls, the pipes, even the dirt in our backyards.
It's everywhere,
No wonder people are concerned.
and they should be. But the good news is that we know more about the dangers of lead now than ever before, and we have ways to test for it, remediate it, and protect ourselves from further exposure.
Okay, that is reassuring. But what about people who grew up in older homes or were exposed to leaded gas? Is there anything they can do now to mitigate the damage?
That's a great question, and one that we'll definitely delve deeper into in the next part of our deep dive. But first, I think it's important to talk about some of the other sources of lead exposure, because this is a story with more twists and turns than you might expect.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
For example, did you know that until recently, some aviation fuels still contained lead?
Seriously. So even today, there are people being exposed to lead from airplanes.
It's a complicated issue. There are a lot of economic and logistical factors at play. But the point is, lead is still out there, lurking in unexpected places. And that's why awareness is so important. The more we understand about the sources of lead and the risks involved, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves and advocate for change.
I hear you, knowledge is power, right? But I think we've given everyone enough to chew on for now. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll dig into what you can actually do to protect yourself from lead exposure, even if you think you've already been exposed. Welcome back, everyone. So we've been talking about lead and how this is a much bigger deal than a lot of us probably realized. But what does all this actually mean for us moving forward? Can we, like, undo the damage from past exposure?
Yeah.
Or are we kind of stuck with it?
That's a good question. And like a lot of things with lead exposure, the answer is it's complicated. We can't really reverse brain development that's already happened. But our brains are amazingly adaptable. There are definitely steps we can take to support our overall well-being and maybe offset some of the effects of lead exposure.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. But I'm still a little stuck on this idea that lead exposure can have generational effects. Like, how does lead from my parents' generation end up affecting me?
It's a little mind-blowing, right? So one way this happens is through direct exposure in the womb. Lead can actually cross the placental barrier. So if a pregnant woman is exposed to lead, it can pass directly to the developing fetus.
Oh, wow. So even before baby is born, they could already be facing the consequences of lead exposure.
It's pretty heavy stuff, but it's not just about that direct exposure in utero. Lead can also stick around in the environment for a really long time. It builds up in soil dust and even water. And this creates a risk for young children because they tend to explore their surroundings with their hands and mouths.
Right, playing in the dirt, putting their hands in their mouth. It doesn't seem so innocent when you think about the potential for lead exposure. And, this makes me think about what we were saying earlier about older homes and neighborhoods. Are some communities more at risk than others when it comes to lead?
Absolutely. Lead exposure is not distributed equally, unfortunately. Communities with older housing stock, especially places built before lead paint was banned in 1978, tend to have higher levels of lead contamination.
And what about proximity to busy roadways or former industrial sites?
Oh, yeah, for sure. That increases the risk even more.
So this isn't just about individual health then. It's also about environmental justice and how certain communities are hit harder by this legacy of lead.
Exactly. And it's so important to acknowledge that these communities often face other challenges too, like limited access to healthcare, healthy food, educational resources. All of these factors can make the effects of lead exposure even worse and make it much harder for people to thrive.
Right. It's like this whole web of social and economic factors all tangled up together. Okay, so we've got this legacy of lead exposure potentially affecting millions of people across generations. What does that actually mean for society as a whole?
Well, when you have a lot of people potentially struggling with things like cognitive and behavioral consequences of lead exposure, it's going to have ripple effects on society. Think about things like how well people do in school, how productive they are at work, even crime rates.
Really, crime rates too.
Yeah, some researchers have even suggested a link between lead exposure and things like increased aggression and impulsivity, which could lead to higher crime rates.
So something as seemingly simple as taking lead out of gasoline could have a domino effect on all these different parts of society.
It's definitely something to think about. It really highlights how connected environmental health and social well-being are. You can't separate these issues. And there's a lot more research happening to try and understand the true cost of lead exposure.
So what can we do about it? We can't just go back in time and undo the damage.
No, we can't change the past.
Yeah.
But we can learn from it and use that knowledge to create a healthier future. And that starts with awareness.
Okay, but what about the communities that are already dealing with high levels of lead?
Well, there are a number of remediation efforts that are happening. One major area is lead abatement in housing. This involves finding and safely removing lead-based paint and other sources of contamination from homes.
So cleaning up the environment where people live, work, and play? You mentioned nutritional interventions earlier. Did those play a role in cleaning things up as well?
They do. Certain nutrients like calcium, iron, and vitamin C can actually help reduce lead absorption in the body.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, there are programs that provide nutritional counseling and supplements to families in these communities. And it's not just about addressing existing exposure. This can also help protect kids from future harm.
So cleaning up the environment and supporting people's health from the inside out.
Right.
I like that approach. But I got to be honest, I'm still feeling kind of pessimistic about all this. Like lead is a tough opponent. Is it even possible to get rid of it completely?
It is a tough battle. There's no doubt about that. We may never completely eradicate lead from our environment,
Hmm.
but we can definitely make huge progress towards reducing exposure. And that's where things like innovation and working together come in.
Okay, innovation. What's on the horizon?
Well, there's some really exciting developments in environmental remediation. Scientists and engineers are coming up with new technologies to get lead out of soil and water.
Like what?
For example, some researchers are experimenting with plants that can absorb lead from the soil.
Plants that eat lead.
It's called phytoremediation. And there's a growing movement to hold industries accountable for lead contamination and to invest in cleanup efforts.
So it's not just about cleaning up the messes we've already made, it's about preventing new ones.
Exactly. And that requires a shift in how we think about things.
Okay, but let's bring it back to our listeners for a minute. What can people do on a personal level to protect themselves and their families?
That's a great question. And we'll talk about some specific steps you can take right after a quick break.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the history of lead exposure and how it impacts our health and society. But now I want to know, what can our listeners actually do to protect themselves and their families?
Well, the good news is we're not just helpless bystanders in this story. We can actually make a difference. And one of the best things you can do is just get informed. We've mentioned a lot of resources today, and we'll be sure to include links to those in the show notes. But don't stop there, Do your own research, learn more about this issue, and become an advocate for change.
Right. Knowledge is power. But what are some things that people can do, like right now?
So if you live in an older home, especially one built before 1978, the first thing you should do is get it tested for lead. There are certified professionals who can do this, and it's a pretty simple process. They can check for lead paint, lead dust, and even lead in your water if you have older plumbing.
And what if you're renting?
Oh, yeah. Definitely talk to your landlord or property manager about lead testing. You have a right to know about potential hazards in your home.
Okay, but what happens if you do find lead?
Yeah. Well, it's understandable to be concerned, but there are ways to deal with lead hazards safely and effectively. So, for example, if you have lead paint, don't try to scrape it or sand it yourself. You'll want to hire a certified lead abatement professional. They can remove or encapsulate the paint safely.
So no DIY projects when it comes to lead paint.
Definitely not. And if you have lead in your water, you can install a filter that's certified to remove lead. Or, if it's possible, you might even consider replacing those old pipes.
Okay, so that's what to do if you find lead. But are there ways to prevent exposure in the first place?
For sure. Simple things like washing your hands frequently, especially before you eat, can make a big difference.
Okay.
And make sure you're washing your children's hands and faces regularly, too. They're more vulnerable to lead exposure because they tend to put their hands in their mouths and spend more time playing on the floor.
Yeah, my mom was always on me about washing my hands before dinner.
Another thing to be aware of is lead dust. You might not be able to see it, but it can build up on surfaces, especially in older homes. So regularly wet mopping your floors and wiping down surfaces with a damp cloth can really help get rid of that lead dust.
Okay, so keeping things clean and being aware of potential sources of lead. What about those nutritional interventions we talked about? Can those help with prevention too?
Absolutely. Eating a healthy diet that's high in calcium, iron, and vitamin C can actually help reduce how much lead your body absorbs.
Oh, interesting. So it's like giving your body extra defenses against lead.
Exactly.
And there are other things you can do for your overall health.
Right. Things like getting enough sleep, managing stress, and exercising regularly. Those can all help your body deal with any past lead exposure.
So it's really about taking a holistic approach.
Absolutely. And don't forget about the power of collective action. Talk to your friends and family about lead exposure. Share what you've learned. Become an advocate for stricter lead regulations. Support organizations working to clean up contamination. And contact your elected officials.
Right. Make your voice heard.
Together, we can make a future where lead exposure is a thing of the past.
Well said. So even though lead exposure is a serious issue, it's not hopeless. We can make a difference by learning more, taking action, and working together.
I completely agree.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next week with a brand new topic. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay healthy.